She pressed her bleeding palms flat against a stranger's door and made herself a promise she would rather die on this mountain than go back to that man. Behind her 3 counties away, a contract with her name on it said she belonged to someone who had never once asked what she wanted. Ahead of her, a silent cowboy with grieving eyes looked at her torn wedding dress and asked, "Nothing, just stepped aside and let her in." If you've ever had to build your life from nothing but your own 2 hands, this story is for you. Subscribe and follow Clara's journey to the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to the Wyoming Territory like a punishment. The creek beds cracked. The grass turned pale and brittle as old bone. The cattle on Everett Dawson's mountain ranch had dropped 40 pounds apiece since May, and the banknote sitting on his kitchen table said he had until the 1st of September to make things right or surrender the deed. Everett had read that letter 4 times. Each time he set it back down in the same spot and walked outside and looked at the land his father had broken his back to build, and he felt something hollow move through his chest that he didn't have a name for anymore. He'd had a name for it once: grief. But grief was supposed to soften with years. Whatever lived in him now was harder than grief. It had edges. He was mending the south fence post when he heard the wagon. It wasn't one of his men. The sound was wrong, too light, too uncertain, the horse moving like it wasn't sure of the road. Everett straightened up and pushed his hat back on his head and squinted down toward the ridge road that cut through the pine trees. The wagon came into view and stopped at the edge of the yard. The driver, a boy, maybe 16, hired from town, didn't even climb down from the seat. He just looked at Everett with something close to apology on his face, set the brake, and then reached back and pulled a canvas bag from behind him and dropped it to the ground. The woman climbed down herself. She didn't wait for help. She stepped off the wagon board and landed in the dirt and picked up her own bag and stood there in the full glare of the July sun. And Everett Dawson looked at her and felt the hollow thing in his chest shift position. She was wearing a dress that had been white once. The hem was brown with trail dust. One sleeve had a long tear from the shoulder, nearly to the elbow, and she'd pinned it back with what looked like a piece of wire. Her dark hair was pulled back, but half of it had come loose, and she hadn't bothered to fix it. Her jaw was set. Her eyes moved over the ranch, the barn, the bunkhouse, the main house, with the focused measuring look of someone calculating what needed to be done, not what could be admired. She had the hands of a woman who worked. He noticed that before anything else. The wagon turned and headed back down the road without a word from the boy. Everett didn't move. She walked toward him. I was expecting her to stop at a polite distance the way town women did when they weren't sure of their welcome. She didn't stop. She came up close enough that he could see the cut on her lower lip and the shadow of exhaustion under her eyes, and she looked at him directly and said, "Mr. Dawson, my name is Clara Whitmore. I was told you need a cook." He stared at her. "Who told you that?" "The man at the feed store in Millhaven. He said your last cook quit 3 weeks ago, and your men are eating badly, and you haven't found a replacement." She paused. "He said you were difficult to work for." "He's right." "Good," she said. "I'm not looking for easy." Everett looked at her for a long moment. The cut on her lip, the torn sleeve, the dress that was all wrong for a mountain ranch in the middle of summer, the kind of dress a woman wore to something important, something that required ceremony. "That's a wedding dress," he said. Something moved across her face, fast controlled, gone in under a second. "It was," she said. "It isn't anymore." "Where's your husband?" "I don't have one." "Where's the man who was supposed to become your husband?" She met his eyes without flinching. 3 counties behind me, I expect, moving slower than I did. A beat. "Are you going to offer me the position or not?" "Mr. Dawson, because I've been on that wagon since 4 this morning, and I would like to know whether I need to start walking again." Everett took his hat off, turned it in his hands once, put it back on. "What can you cook?" he said. She could cook. That became clear by supper time, when 6 ranch hands who had been surviving on burned beans and salt pork for 3 weeks sat down at the long table in the bunkhouse kitchen and went silent for the first time in recent memory, not out of discomfort, but out of something that bordered on reverence. Clara had found dried venison in the back of the larder, half a sack of cornmeal onions that were past their prime, but still good at their centers, and a jar of preserved peppers that someone had put up and forgotten about. She'd produced a stew that filled the room with a smell that made grown men close their eyes. She stood at the far end of the kitchen and watched them eat, and she didn't ask for compliments, and she didn't make conversation. And Everett, who ate standing up in the doorway, as was his habit, watched her watch his men and thought that she was doing exactly what he did, cataloging, measuring, figuring out what she was working with. His foreman, a broad, skeptical man named Walt Greer, who had been with the ranch since Everett's father's time, leaned over to the hand beside him and said in a voice not quite low enough, "Give her a week." Clara didn't look up from the pot she was cleaning. "Give me 2, she said evenly, "and I'll have your bread rising by Tuesday." Walt looked at the back of her head, then he looked at Everett. Everett looked at the wall. "Yes, ma'am," Walt said, and went back to his stew. "Tate." High gave her the small room at the back of the main house that had belonged to the previous cook. A wall, a window, a narrow bed, and a hook for her bag. She didn't thank him excessively. She looked at the room, set her bag down, and said, "Is there a lock on this door?" "No." She nodded once, absorbing that. "I'll need one. I'll send Walt into town tomorrow. I'd rather go myself and choose it." He looked at her. "All right. Thank you, Mr. Dawson." She closed the door, and that was the end of the conversation. Everett didn't sleep well that night. He wasn't sure why. The ranch was quiet. The cattle were settled. The bank letter was where it always was on the kitchen table, waiting to be dealt with in the morning. The same as it had been waiting to be dealt with every morning for 6 weeks. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the mountain sounds wind through the pines. A coyote somewhere far off the creak of the house settling, and he thought about the cut on Clara Whitmore's lip. It wasn't fresh. 2 days old, maybe 3. Whatever had put it there, it hadn't been recent. But it also hadn't been an accident. He'd seen enough accidents on a working ranch to know the difference between a cut from a fall and a cut from something deliberate. He turned on his side and closed his eyes. It wasn't his business. She'd asked for work. He'd given her work. That was the beginning and end of his obligation. He told himself that twice before he fell asleep. She had been at the ranch for 4 days when the first real test came. It wasn't the men they had grumbled the first morning and gone silent by the second, won over by biscuits that actually rose and coffee that was actually hot. It wasn't the work she moved through the kitchen and the yard with a quiet, unhurried efficiency that he recognized as the particular competence of someone who had been doing hard work since they were very young. The test came in the form of Hank Pruitt. Hank was the youngest hand on the ranch, 22 good with horses and not much else. I was the kind of young man who had learned somewhere along the way that the easiest way to feel big was to make someone else feel small. He'd never done it in front of Everett. He'd done it plenty of times when Everett wasn't around. Walt had told him so once when Hank had been particularly unkind to a new hire who left after a week. Everett was crossing the yard when he heard Hank's voice from inside the kitchen, carrying the particular tone of someone performing for an audience. "You know what I think," Hank was saying. "I think you ran out on your own wedding because nobody in their right mind would actually want you." Everett stopped. Inside the kitchen, Clara didn't respond immediately. He could hear the sound of her working something being set on the stove, a spoon against iron. "I think," Hank continued louder now, enjoying himself, "that whatever man you were supposed to marry took one look at the real you and decided he'd rather—" "You burned your hand last Tuesday," Clara said. A pause. "What?" Hank said. "Your right hand. You burned it on the branding iron. I saw you wrap it. You've been favoring it all week, which is why your fence work on the south line is coming up short. You can't grip the wire properly." Another pause. "I made a poultice for burns. It's on the shelf above the window, wrapped in brown cloth. You should use it before infection sets in, or you'll lose 2 weeks of work instead of 1. Silence. Then Hank said, his voice stripped of its performance, confused and off balance. "Why would you do that? I was just—" "I know what you were doing," Clara said. "I've heard worse. I'm telling you about the poultice because it's the practical thing to do, and I don't let personal feelings get in the way of practical things. Neither should you. A beat. The biscuits will be ready in 10 minutes. Don't be late. Everett stood in the yard for a moment. Then he walked around to the other side of the barn and finished what he'd been going to do. That evening after supper, he found her on the back steps of the main house, sitting with her knees up and her hands around a tin cup of water, looking out at the mountain, in the way people look at things when they're not really seeing them, when they're somewhere else entirely. He came and stood near, not crowding her, and after a moment, she moved over on the step without being asked, and he sat down. They were quiet for a while. "You could have reported Hank to me," he said. "I handled it." "I know you did. I'm saying you didn't have to." She looked at the mountain. "I've been handling things myself for a long time, Mr. Dawson. It's easier than waiting to see if someone else will." He turned his hat in his hands. "How old were you when you started?" "Started what?" "Handling things." She was quiet for a moment. 8, she said. "When my mother got sick. My father, he wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't a man who knew what to do when things went wrong. So I learned to do it instead." "And the man you were supposed to marry?" She looked at him sideways, a careful look. "My father owed Victor Langley money," she said. "More money than he was ever going to be able to pay back. Victor is a businessman. He likes transactions that benefit him. The transaction he proposed was, the debt disappears and I marry him." Her voice was level, the way someone's voice gets when they've had a long time to process something and have arrived at the far side of anger where everything goes flat and factual. "My father said yes without asking me. Everett didn't say anything. I found out the morning of the wedding," she continued. "From Victor himself. He told me over breakfast very calmly exactly what the arrangement was, as if he was explaining a business deal." She stopped. "He wasn't wrong. That's what it was." Another stop. "I decided I would rather be poor and free than wealthy and owned, so I left." In the dress. "I didn't have time to change." He was quiet for a moment. "That cut on your lip." She touched it with one finger, almost unconsciously. "Victor was not pleased when I told him no." The hollow thing in Everett's chest moved again. It had a sharper quality to it this time. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her first name, and they both heard it. "It's healing," she said, firmly, the way someone closes a door. "I'm all right, Mr. Dawson." He let it go. He stood up and put his hat back on and looked at the mountain. "Everett," he said, "I'm sorry. My name. If we're going to live on the same property, you might as well use it." She looked up at him. For just a moment, something softened in her face. Not weakness, but something quieter than her usual expression, something that hadn't been hardened yet. "Everett," she said, testing the word. "All right." He nodded once and went inside. The days found their shape. Clara rose before anyone else. He could hear her in the kitchen before first light, and he had started rising earlier himself, not to watch her work, but because he had forgotten that the sound of another person moving through a house was a sound he'd missed. She made coffee that was strong enough to mean it, and she left a cup on the kitchen table without being asked, and he drank it standing at the window, looking at the early light on the mountain. They didn't talk much in those first light hours, but they didn't need to. She had a way of knowing what needed to be done without being told. The root cellar had been disorganized for 2 years. She reorganized it in an afternoon without mentioning it. The supply list she gave him at the end of the first week was half the length of his previous cooks, because she'd looked at what they had and figured out what they actually needed versus what was habit. "You've run a household before," he said one morning. "I've run my family's farm since I was 15, she said. "It's not different." "It is a little different. There are 8 men here. 12 of them at my father's place during harvest plus my sister's." She was cutting bread and didn't look up. "I can count. I can manage." "I didn't say you couldn't." She glanced at him. "No," she said. "You didn't." A pause. "I'm sorry. I do that. I hear criticism that isn't there. It's a habit." "A habit from what?" She was quiet for a moment. from living with people who were always watching for me to fail. He didn't know what to say to that, so he drank his coffee. The bank letter had been on the table for 7 weeks when Art Conley rode up from Millhaven. Conley was the regional officer for the Territorial Savings and Loan, a careful, apologetic man who did not enjoy delivering bad news but did so reliably and on schedule. He tied his horse at the post and knocked on the door of the main house with his hat already in his hands, which was never a good sign. Everett met him on the porch. "Everett," Conley said, "I need to talk to you about the note. I know what the notice says. They've moved the date up." Conley looked genuinely pained. "August 15th. That's the new deadline. I argued against it, you know I did, but there's been pressure from above and—" "August 15th, Everett repeated. "That's 5 weeks." "I know. The fall cattle aren't ready to move until September at the earliest. You know that." "I know, Everett. I'm sorry." Clara appeared in the doorway behind Everett. She looked at Conley with her measuring expression, then at Everett's back, and then she stepped to one side out of the conversation, giving it space. But she didn't leave. Conley cleared his throat. There may be another option," he said carefully. "There's a buyer. He's been inquiring about mountain properties in this district. He's made offers on 3 other ranches already, and he pays fair, technically." "Who is it?" Conley hesitated. "Victor Langley," he said. "He's been expanding his land holdings north from Colorado all spring." The silence that followed had a quality to it. Everett did not turn around, but he felt Clara go absolutely still in the doorway behind him. "Tell Langley," Everett said, his voice coming out very quiet and very even, "that the Dawson Ranch is not for sale. Everett, if the note comes due and you can't, then I'll find another way." He looked at Conley steadily. "Thank you for writing up Art. I'll see you at the August deadline." Conley looked at him. Then after a moment he put his hat back on, nodded once, and rode back down the mountain. Everett stood on the porch for a moment after he was gone. Then he turned around. Clara was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not soft exactly, but unguarded in a way she hadn't been since she arrived. "You knew that name," he said. "Yes." "Victor Langley is the man who was going to marry you." "Yes." He looked at her. "And he's been buying land all spring, moving north." He paused. "From Colorado." She held his gaze. "He knew I left," she said. "He would have found out where I went. He's thorough, Everett. He doesn't let go of things he considers his. You're not his. I know that." Her voice was steady. "But he doesn't." She paused. "He wants your land. He may want it because it's valuable land, or he may want it because someone told him I was here." She held his gaze directly. "I can leave. If my being here is causing you—" "You're not leaving," he said. She stopped. "You took a job," he said. "You've done the job. I don't send workers away because someone else has a problem with them being here." He held her eyes. "And I don't sell Dawson land to men like Victor Langley." She stared at him for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Why not?" "Because my father built this land with his hands. Because my wife is buried on this mountain. Because—" He stopped himself. The mention of his wife came out before he chose it the way things did, when he was tired and not guarding himself properly. He pressed his jaw together. "Because it's mine," he said. "And what's mine, I keep." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "Then let me help." "Help with what?" "The note, the cattle. There must be something." She stopped herself, reordered her thoughts, started again. "I know what I'm asking. I know I'm already here on your charity to some degree, regardless of the wage. It's not charity, you work for your wage. But I know land and livestock. My father's farm wasn't a ranch, but the principles aren't so different. If the fall cattle aren't ready to move, then maybe the problem isn't the cattle. Maybe it's the feed or the water access or—" She stopped. "Show me the ranch," she said. "All of it. Not just the kitchen and the yard. Show me the whole operation. Let me think about it." He looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. She was not afraid of the mountain. He had expected her to be. Most people were at first the sheer scale of it, the silence, the way the wind moved differently at altitude. He had watched his own men coming up from lower country take a week or two to adjust to the feeling of so much space with no comfort in it. Clara put on her working boots the next morning and walked beside him across the upper pasture and through the stands of pine to the eastern water source. And she looked at everything with her same measuring expression, and she asked questions that were more specific than he expected. How long has this creek been running this low? Since May. And before that? Normal. She looked upstream, then down. Is there a diversion above? He hadn't thought about that. The creek had always fed naturally from the snowmelt above the tree line, and the idea that something upstream could be interfering hadn't occurred to him because it had always just been water, just been there. I don't know, he said. We should look, she said. If the water's being diverted even naturally, even by a rockfall or a beaver dam, it would explain why the cattle are losing weight even with enough grass. They're not drinking enough. He looked at her. My father's farm had a creek, she said simply. We learned to look upstream. They rode up to the high country after lunch. Everett on his gray quarter horse, Clara on the quietest saddle horse in the stable, a steady chestnut mare she'd somehow already befriended. It took 2 hours to reach the high meadow above the tree line, and the wind was different there, colder and more purposeful, and Clara pulled her jacket tighter and kept riding and didn't complain. He found the blockage before she did. It wasn't a beaver dam, it wasn't a rock fall. It was a deliberate diversion, a crude but effective one. Pine logs and packed earth channeling a significant portion of the creek's flow away from the Dawson property line and into the drainage that ran along the edge of the neighboring land. Everett crouched down and looked at it. Fresh cut ends on the timber. Dirt packed within the last few weeks. This is recent, he said. Clara crouched beside him. Who owns the land to the east? That's open territory, technically federal land. He paused. But someone's been moving cattle through it all summer. I've seen the tracks. Someone who would benefit from your cattle losing weight, she said. Someone who would benefit from you defaulting on your banknote. He stood up slowly. Someone like Victor Langley, she said. He looked at the diversion. He looked at the land beyond it. He turned and looked at Clara, who was looking at him with those clear, exhausted, entirely honest eyes. And he thought about what she had said. He doesn't let go of things he considers his. I need to get to Millhaven, he said. I need to talk to a lawyer. And you need witnesses, she said. Photographs if there's someone in town with a camera. Documentation. If this goes to a land dispute in the territorial court. You know about land disputes and territorial court. She stood up. My father lost his farm, she said simply. I watched it happen. I paid attention. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said, Clara. Yes? I'm glad you didn't change out of that dress before you left. She blinked. Then something happened on her face. Not a smile exactly, but the possibility of one the shape of something that might become a smile if it were given enough time and enough reason. I'm glad I knocked on your fence post and not someone else's, she said. He turned his horse back toward the ranch. She fell in beside him, and they rode down through the pines as the afternoon light went long and gold across the mountain, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was not the kind that needed to be filled. The ride back down the mountain was quiet, but it was not an empty quiet. Everett rode with his jaw set and his eyes forward, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but calculation. The particular silence of a man turning a problem over in his hands and looking for the place where it could be broken. Clara rode beside him and let him think. She had learned in 4 days that Everett Dawson was not a man who needed to be prompted. He was a man who needed space. Most women she had known would have found that maddening. She found it restful. She was doing her own thinking anyway. Victor Langley had been buying land for months. Moving north from Colorado in a deliberate, patient line the way a careful man built something not with force, but with pressure, with money and time, and the particular advantage of knowing that most people would eventually give way if you waited long enough and made things difficult enough. He had done it to her family. He had turned the screws on her father's debt over 3 careful years, until the only thing left to offer was Clara herself, and her father had offered it. She had not allowed herself to be used then. She was not going to allow herself to be the reason Everett Dawson lost his mountain. She had to think about that carefully, because there was a version of this story where her presence here made everything worse, where Victor's pursuit of this land was personal as much as financial, where she was the variable that turned a business transaction into a vendetta. She had seen what Victor Langley's vendettas looked like. She still had the proof of it on her lip. They came through the last stand of pines, and the ranch yard opened up ahead of them, and Hank was by the water trough, and Walt was coming out of the barn, and Clara noticed both of them clock her return on horseback beside Everett, and do the particular thing that men in close quarters do, file the information away without commenting on it. She dismounted before Everett could offer to help, took her own horse to the rail, loosened the cinch herself. She heard him behind her doing the same. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll ride to Mill Haven. Talk to Jim Hart. He's the territorial land attorney." "Take Walt with you," she said. "And take someone who can write clearly. You'll want a formal record of what we found." "You could come." She paused at the saddle buckle. "I could," she said. "But if Langley has people in that town, and he will because he always does, then me walking into a lawyer's office with you turns this into something public before you're ready for it to be public." She pulled the saddle free and turned to face him. "You need the legal ground solid before he knows you're building it." Everett looked at her for a moment. "You think like someone who's been in a fight before." "I've been in this particular fight before," she said. "I just lost it." She met his eyes. "I'd rather help you win yours." She carried the saddle into the barn without waiting for his response. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room at the back of the house and listened to the mountain, which had its own nighttime language, wind and pine, and the occasional sound of cattle shifting in the distance, and she thought about the freshly cut ends of those pine logs. Someone had been up there recently. Someone who knew where the water ran and knew what cutting it off would do to the Dawson cattle over a summer. Someone who had planned this slowly and patiently, the way Victor Langley planned everything. The question was, how long had he known she was here? She hadn't told anyone where she was going when she left. The boy from Millhaven who'd driven her up hadn't known her name. The man at the feed store had just pointed her toward the ranch and said there was work. It was possible, barely possible, that Victor's pursuit of this land had nothing to do with her, that it was purely financial, that she was a coincidence. She almost convinced herself of that. Then she thought about the timing. Victor had been moving north all spring. The banknote pressure had started in early summer. The water diversion was recent, within the last few weeks, and she had arrived 3 weeks ago. She sat up in the dark and pressed her hands flat on the mattress and breathed. She was not going to run again. She had decided that on the wagon ride up the mountain, without quite putting it into words, that the running was finished, that whatever came next, she would face from a standing position. She had decided it again when she looked at Everett Dawson for the first time and said, "I am not asking for kindness, I am asking for work." But deciding not to run and knowing how to stand were two different things, and right now she needed to figure out the second one before Victor arrived to test it. She got up, put on her boots, went to the kitchen and built the fire back up and put the coffee on, and she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup and thought until the sky started to go gray. Everett found her there at first light. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, the cup, the fire, the alert, sleepless expression she was wearing, and he didn't ask if she was all right, which she was grateful for, because she was not particularly all right, and the question would have required either lying or explaining. He poured his own coffee and sat down across from her. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know. I could hear you thinking through the wall." She looked at him. Something flickered in his eyes that was almost humor, and she felt the tension in her chest ease just slightly. "The water diversion isn't enough," she said. "Even if you document it, even if Jim Hart files an injunction that takes time, weeks, maybe longer, and the banknote is in 5 weeks. I know. So the cattle need a faster solution." She turned her cup in her hands. The east pasture, you're not using it. It's overgrown, hasn't been worked in 2 years. I know. I walked it yesterday morning while you were at the south fence. There's good grass under the scrub, Everett. And there's a spring-fed pool in the northeast corner that's still running clean. If you move 20 head up there for the next month, they'll recover weight faster than anything still on the main pasture. He was quiet, looking at her. The scrub will slow them down for a day or two, she continued. But cattle push through brush when they're thirsty enough, and they'll find that pool within the first afternoon. After that, she stopped herself, aware suddenly that she was telling a rancher how cattle behaved, which was possibly overstepping. I apologize. You know your animals better than I do. No, he said. Keep going. She looked at him carefully. He meant it. After that, it's just time and water and enough to eat, she said, which you have if you move them. And I can help. I can manage the supplemental feeding if you tell me what you have in stores. I've done feed rationing before. On your father's farm. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You said you lost the farm, he said. How? She set down her cup. Victor Langley bought the debt from the original creditor, she said. We didn't know he'd done it until the terms changed. New terms, new timeline, new pressure. My father tried to renegotiate, and Victor said yes to everything as long as the deal included me. She paused. My father didn't say no fast enough, and by the time I understood what was happening, the papers were already drawn. And the land? Gone. Her voice was flat. Victor bought it at the debt settlement price. He'll turn it into grazing land for his cattle operation, which is what he wants all of it for. He's building something large, Everett. He doesn't want one ranch, he wants a territory. Everett's hands tightened around his cup, slightly. A controlled movement from a man who kept himself controlled. He's not getting this one, he said. Not if we're fast, she agreed. He looked at her across the table, and something shifted in the room, subtle, like a change in air pressure before weather. Though we had landed in the conversation without either of them planning it, and they both heard it, and neither of them moved to take it back. I'll move the cattle today, he said. Walt and Pete can manage it. I'll ride to Millhaven tomorrow for Hearth. He paused. I want you here while I'm gone. I'll be here. Not just to cook, he said. Keep your eyes open. If anyone comes to the ranch while I'm gone, anyone from town, any strangers, you tell Walt immediately, and you don't engage alone. She looked at him steadily. I'm not fragile, Everett. I didn't say fragile. I said don't engage alone. His voice was patient but firm. There's a difference between capable and outnumbered. You know that. She did know that. She had learned it the hard way. All right, she said. Walt Greer had opinions about the East Pasture Plan. He expressed them thoroughly in the yard with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back in the manner of a man who considered himself to have been around long enough to know when an idea was going to cause extra work. It's overgrown, he said. I know, Everett said. We'll lose half a day just getting them through the east gate. I know. And if that pool's gone dry? It hasn't. Walt looked at him. Then he looked at the main house where Clara was visible through the kitchen window moving between the stove and the counter. Then he looked back at Everett. She'd tell you about the pool, he said. She walked the east pasture yesterday morning. Walt was quiet for a moment. Huh, he said. Gather Pete and Calhoun, Everett said. Get it done before noon. Yes, boss. Walt turned toward the barn, then stopped. Without turning back, he said, She's got a good eye. She does. Still giving her a week, Walt said, and kept walking. The cattle moved. It took longer than Everett had predicted, and less time than Walt had predicted, which seemed to satisfy both of them in different ways. By early afternoon, 20 head were pushing through the east scrub in the way cattle do. Cattle do determined, unhurried, following the animal ahead, without much opinion about the destination. Clara watched from the fence rail with Pete's younger brother Caleb, who was 14 and had appointed himself her unofficial assistant on grounds that had never been clearly articulated, but seemed to involve being nearby when she was baking. They'll find the pool, she told him. How do you know? Caleb asked. Because they're thirsty, and the wind's coming from the northeast, she said. They can smell water from a quarter mile in dry weather. They'll push straight to it. Caleb considered this. My ma says you ran away from your wedding, he said in the tone of someone relaying information rather than making a judgment. Your ma is correct, Clara said. How come? Because the man I was supposed to marry wasn't a good man. Caleb thought about that. Mr. Dawson's a good man, he said. I know he is. He doesn't say it, but he is. He let my family stay on through last winter when things were bad, and he didn't ask for anything back for it. Clara looked at the cattle moving through the brush. That's the kind of good that matters, she said. Not the kind people talk about. The kind people do when they think nobody's watching. Caleb nodded seriously, as if this was information he was filing away. The lead cow pushed through to the pool 40 minutes later, and the rest followed in the patient, inexorable way of animals who have made up their minds. The first stranger arrived 3 days after Everett left for Millhaven. She heard the horse before she saw the rider she had developed in childhood and sharpened in recent weeks, a particular sensitivity to sounds that didn't belong to the rhythm of a normal day. This horse came from the South Road, not the mountain trail, and it came at a pace that wasn't the casual approach of someone with ordinary business. She dried her hands on her apron and went to find Walt, who was at the barn, already having heard it too. The rider was a man she didn't recognize, late 30s, well-dressed for ranch country, with the particular posture of someone who had money and was accustomed to it registering. He drew up in the yard and didn't dismount, which was itself a communication. I'm looking for the property owner, he said. Not here, Walt said. Back tomorrow. Can I help you? I represent an interested party, the man said. A buyer for this property. He looked around the yard with an assessing expression. My employer has made a generous offer to the Territorial Bank. It may be in Mr. Dawson's interest to speak with us before the deadline. Walt crossed his arms. Mr. Dawson knows about all the offers, he said. His answer's the same as it's always been. His financial situation has changed, the man said. He had the smooth, measured cadence of someone trained to make pressure sound reasonable. My employer simply wants a conversation, a fair one. Who is your employer? Clara said. She had come out of the main house and crossed the yard without either man noticing, and the rider's eyes moved to her with a flicker of something recognition calculation quickly hidden. He didn't know her, but he recognized the type of question. Victor Langley, the man said. He's acquiring land in this territory and would like to speak with Mr. Dawson is not interested, Clara said. Her voice was steady and clear. He has retained legal counsel in Millhaven and is addressing the banknote through appropriate channels. If Mr. Langley has a legitimate business interest, he can submit a written inquiry through Jim Hearth's office. She held the rider's eyes. Is there anything else? The man looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, a reassessment. You're Clara Whitmore, he said. She didn't flinch. I'm the cook, she said. Good day. She turned and walked back to the main house and didn't look back. Behind her she heard Walt say in a voice of perfect composure, You heard the lady? Safe travels. The horse turned. The rider left. Clara got inside the house, closed the door, and stood with her back against it, and her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat on the wood behind her, breathing. He knew she was here. Walt came in 20 minutes later. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and came in and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down, and Clara turned from the window where she'd been standing and looked at him. He recognized your name, Walt said. Yes. Langley sent him specifically looking for you. Possibly. She came to the table and sat across from him. Or Langley sent him for the land, and this man already knew my name because Langley's been looking for me for weeks. She paused. Either way, Victor knows I'm here now. Walt's jaw moved. He was a taciturn man who thought before he spoke, and right now he was thinking hard enough that she could almost follow it. Does Everett know, he said, about you and Langley, the full of it? Some, she said. Enough. You should tell him the rest when he gets back. She looked at her hands. I know. Because if Langley's using your presence here as leverage against the bank deal, I know Walt. Then Everett needs the full picture to fight it right. I said I know. She looked up. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it was tired in a way that acknowledged he was correct without thanking him for it. I'll tell him. Walt nodded once. He pushed back from the table and started to rise. Walt, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said, for handling the rider. He looked at her for a moment. You handled the rider, he said. I just stood there looking large. He put on his hat. That was good thinking, making him go through the lawyer. It won't stop Victor. No, Walt agreed. But it makes him work properly. Buys time. He went back out to the yard, and Clara sat at the table alone and thought about time and how much of it they had and whether it would be enough. Everett came back the following evening. He came through the door with the particular energy of a man who had been in motion all day and hadn't fully stopped yet, and he read the room in the way of someone who has learned to pay attention. He looked at Clara, then at Walt, who was at the table eating, and something in the quality of the silence told him that things had happened in his absence. He sat down. Clara put food in front of him. He looked at her. Tell me, he said. She told him. All of it the writer. Victor Langley's name, the recognition what she'd said, what she hadn't said. She told it flat and sequential the way she reported things when she was keeping her own reaction out of the way. When she finished, he ate for a moment without speaking. You sent him to Hart's office, he said. Yes. That was exactly right. It won't hold him. No. Everett agreed. But Jim Hart is already drawing up the injunction on the water diversion. He'll have it filed by Monday, and he found something else. He set down his fork. The land to the east that's been used for Langley's cattle all summer, it's federal grazing land. Unauthorized use. If Langley's been running cattle on federal territory to undermine a neighboring claim, that's a federal land violation on top of the water diversion. Clara stared at him. Federal, she said. Federal, he confirmed. Which takes it out of the territorial court and puts it in front of a U.S. land commissioner. Jim's already written to the Denver office. Walt set down his coffee with a sound that for Walt constituted an exclamation. How long? Clara said. Weeks possibly. But the filing itself, the moment it's on record, changes the pressure. Langley can't move on this land while a federal investigation is open without it looking exactly like what it is. Clara sat back. Something moved through her, not relief, not yet, but the first distant outline of it. He'll escalate, she said, when he finds out. Yes, Everett said. He doesn't respond to legal obstacles by retreating. He responds by finding a different angle. I know. You know because I'm telling you from experience, she said. Victor Langley is patient, and he's smart, and he doesn't stop. He'll come at this from somewhere else. She looked at Everett directly. He'll come at you through me if he can. Through my reputation, through my presence here, he'll make it look like something it isn't, in order to undermine your standing in the community. Everett held her gaze. Let him try, he said. Everett. Her voice was careful. I've seen him destroy a person's standing in a town in 3 weeks. My father. People who'd known him for 20 years stopped trusting him because Victor is very good at planting the right seed in the right place and then doing nothing, just waiting for it to grow. He can plant whatever he wants, Everett said. This is my land. My men know who I am, and the people in this county who matter have known my family since before Langley knew this territory existed. He picked up his fork again, which was for Everett a way of closing a discussion. We're not giving him the ground he needs. She looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the particular quality of a man who had been tested by harder things than this and had come out the other side intact, changed but intact. And she thought about what Caleb had said. The kind of good people do when they think nobody's watching. There's something else, she said. He looked up. About me and Victor, she said. There's more than what I told you before. You need to know all of it if you're going to fight this right. The kitchen was quiet. Walt, with the instinct of a man who understood the difference between company and audience, picked up his plate and cup and left the room. Clara folded her hands on the table and told Everett Dawson the rest of it. She told him about the farm first. The full account, not just the debt and the marriage arrangement, But the 3 years before it, the way Victor had inserted himself into her father's financial life so gradually and so helpfully, that by the time the help started feeling like a trap, it was already won. She told him about the documents she'd seen the night before the wedding, the ones that weren't just a marriage contract, but a transfer of her personal right to own property. A clause that once she signed would have made everything she ever earned or inherited legally belong to her husband. She told him about the morning she'd found out. Victor over breakfast, calm and explanatory. She told him what she'd said and what Victor had said in response, and the part of the response that had left the mark on her lip. Everett went very still during this part. She told him that she'd walked out of the breakfast room and into the kitchen and out the back of the house with nothing but the dress she was standing in, and her small bag of personal papers, the ones she'd grabbed the night before, when she'd understood what she was looking at, and that she'd walked 2 miles to the road and gotten on the first wagon heading north and kept going until the mountains were visible, and then kept going further. When she finished, the kitchen was so quiet she could hear the fire settling. "The papers," Everett said. "The ones you took." "They're in my room," she said. "Behind the loose board under the window." He looked at her. "You've been carrying a land transfer document around under a floorboard." "It's evidence," she said. "If Victor ever tries to claim I left voluntarily from a legitimate marriage arrangement, those papers show what the arrangement actually was. Jim Hart should see them." Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been planning that?" She frowned slightly. "Planning what?" "Using those papers as leverage. Bringing them to a lawyer." She shook her head. "I wasn't planning it," she said. "I took them because I was angry and scared, and I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining it, that the trap was real." She paused. The rest of the thinking happened after. He looked at her for a long time, in the particular way he had of looking not intrusive, not measuring for weakness, but taking her seriously, in a way she had not been taken seriously by many people. "You're the most prepared person I've ever met," he said, "and you don't seem to know it." She didn't know what to do with that, so she said, "The papers are in my room. I'll get them tonight and you can take them to Hart." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight you should sleep. I haven't been sleeping well." "I know," he said. "I can hear you thinking through the wall, remember?" She looked at him, and this time the possibility of a smile became an actual one. Small, unexpected, the kind that arrives before you have a chance to prevent it. "I'll try," she said. He nodded and stood, and he was nearly at the doorway to the hall when he stopped. He didn't turn all the way around. He spoke to the doorframe. "Clara," he said, "what he did to you, what he's doing. It's not going to end the way it ended for your father. I want you to hear that clearly." She looked at his back. At the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man making a statement he means to keep. "I hear it," she said. He nodded once and went down the hall, and his bedroom door opened and then closed, and the house settled back into its mountain night sounds. And Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterward, holding a cup that had gone cold, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't hope exactly. It was the thing that comes before hope. The first tentative, terrifying recognition that hope might be possible, that the ground beneath her might actually hold, that she might for the first time in a very long time have landed somewhere that wasn't going to give way. She was careful not to trust it too much. She had been careful before and been wrong. But she sat there in the dark kitchen of a stranger's house on a mountain in Wyoming and let herself feel it for a little while. And that was something she hadn't done in 3 years, and it felt like the first clean breath after a long time, breathing carefully. Outside the mountain was dark and enormous and entirely indifferent, and the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere below the cattle she had moved were sleeping beside water. She got up, washed her cup, and went to bed. She slept. Jim Hart filed the injunction on a Monday. By Wednesday, all of Millhaven knew about it. Everett found out the town knew not from Hart, not from Art Conley at the bank, but from Caleb, who rode up from town with a supply order and arrived at the ranch with the particular wide-eyed energy of a 14-year-old carrying news he considered important. "People are talking," Caleb said, barely off his horse before the words were out. Mr. Hart's filing is posted at the courthouse, and Mr. Pruitt at the general store says Mr. Langley's man was in town yesterday asking questions about the ranch and about—" He stopped, glanced toward the main house, lowered his voice. "About Miss Clara." Everett took the supply order from him. "What kind of questions? About where she came from? Whether she was really working here, or whether she was—" Caleb's ears went red. "He said some things that weren't nice, Mr. Dawson, about why a woman would be living on a ranch with men. Mrs. Pruitt told him to take his business elsewhere, but he'd already said it in front of 4 people. Everett was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had temperature. "You did right telling me," he said. "Put the horse up and get some lunch." I took the supply list into the main house and set it on the kitchen table and stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the wood, looking at nothing. Clara came in from the back room, took one look at him and said, "What happened?" He told her. She received it the way she received most things, standing still, face-controlled processing before reacting. But he had learned to read her stillness by now, the small variations in it, and this one had a particular quality. Resignation without surprise, the look of someone who had been waiting for a specific shoe to drop and had just heard it hit the floor. "It starts with reputation," she said. "It always starts with reputation. Victor makes the insinuation first quietly in public places. Then he waits for the town to do the rest." She sat down at the table. "What did you tell Caleb?" "Nothing yet." "Tell him the truth," she said immediately, "or a version of it he can repeat. That I'm employed here as cook and housekeeper. That I came with a legitimate work inquiry and was hired on merit." She paused. "Caleb talks. That's not a flaw, it's useful. The right story in his mouth reaches half the county by Friday." Everett looked at her. "You want to use a 14-year-old as a telegraph. I want to use an honest 14-year-old who likes me to tell the truth before Victor's version takes root." She met his eyes. "Is it wrong?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "Then tell him." Everett told Caleb. He kept it simple and factual. Clara Whitmore had come to the ranch looking for work. She was capable and honest. She was employed under a fair wage arrangement, and anything anyone said about her character, without knowing her, was gossip and ought to be treated as such. He said it in the yard in front of Walt and Pete, which meant it would spread among the hands as well, and he said it without emphasis or apology, the way he said everything that he considered simply true. Caleb nodded with great seriousness and rode back to town. Walt watched him go. "Smart," he said. "Her idea," Everett said. Walt said nothing, but his expression did something complicated. The next 3 days were surface calm and internally coiled, the particular tension of waiting for a move you know is coming without knowing its exact shape. Everett rode the property lines. Clara managed the household and the supplemental feeding schedule for the East Pasture cattle, who were visibly recovering. The lead cow had gained back 12 pounds in 10 days, which Walt reported with the satisfied air of a man who would not admit he'd been wrong, but was willing to acknowledge results. The federal letter arrived on Thursday. It came through Hart's office, a formal acknowledgement from the U.S. Land Commissioner's office in Denver that the complaint had been received and a preliminary inquiry opened. Hart sent it up by Ryder with the note that said in his careful legal hand, "This is good. It will not be fast, but it is real. Hold the line." Everett read both documents at the kitchen table while Clara stood at the stove. He read them twice, then set them down. "Denver's involved," he said. She turned. Formally. She let out a breath. Not relief. She had learned not to let herself feel relief before things were actually resolved, but the breath of someone who has been holding something heavy and has set it down just for a moment to rest their arms. "Victor will know by end of week," she said. "Yes." "He'll move faster." "Yes." "What does Hart recommend?" "Stay put. Keep the cattle healthy. Don't give him a reason to file a counterclaim." Everett folded the letter and set it inside the front cover of the ranch ledger, where he kept documents he needed to access quickly. "And show up to the county social on Saturday." Clara blinked. "I'm sorry." "The Millhaven Summer Social. 3rd Saturday of July. Every landowner in the county will be there." He looked at her steadily. "Including Victor Langley if his pattern holds. That's Everett. That's exactly where he'll have the most leverage. A public setting, people who don't know me. People who will see you," he said, "standing next to me, as my employee and as a woman with nothing to hide." He paused. "Langley's strategy only works if you're invisible, if you're a rumor, if nobody in this county has a face to put to your name." He held her gaze. "If you walk into that social and you behave exactly as you are, then he doesn't have a shadow to work with." She stared at him. "That's very deliberate thinking," she said. "I've been doing it for 3 days." She looked at the ledger where he'd put the letter, and then at the window, and then at her own hands on the stove rail. "I don't have anything appropriate to wear to a county social," she said. "I have 2 working dresses and the wedding dress, which I've already repurposed into a work apron, so..." Something in Everett's eyes shifted. It wasn't quite humor, and it wasn't quite warmth, but it was in the vicinity of both. "Mrs. Garland in town does alterations," he said. "She owes me a favor." "Everett. Clara." His voice was patient final. "You've earned a dress." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been self-sufficient for so long that being offered something uncomplicated and kind had become harder to receive than hardship. "All right," she said quietly. The dress was green. Dark green, the color of pine needles in August, with clean lines and no unnecessary ornamentation. And when Mrs. Garland held it up in her small shop on Friday afternoon, Clara stood in front of the mirror for a long moment without speaking. She hadn't looked at herself properly in weeks. She had been too busy, or too careful, or too committed to the idea of herself as a working person, rather than a person who looked like anything in particular. The woman in the mirror was someone she almost recognized. "It suits you," Mrs. Garland said. She was a small, direct woman in her 60s, who had measured Clara with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 40 years and had opinions about fabric and nothing else. "You've got the coloring for it." "Thank you," Clara said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Mrs. Garland looked at her in the mirror with the particular look of an older woman who has seen many things and has chosen her battles carefully. "I've heard about you," she said. "What's being said in town?" Clara met her eyes in the mirror. "I expect you have. I've also heard what Caleb Morrison's been saying, which is rather different." Mrs. Garland smoothed the shoulder seam with efficient hands. "I've known Everett Dawson since he was 9 years old. His mother and I were friends." A pause. "He doesn't hire people he doesn't trust. He never has." Another pause, more deliberate. "I thought you ought to know that." Clara looked at herself in the mirror for another moment. At the dress and at the woman inside it who had run away from one life and somehow landed still standing in another. "Thank you," she said again, and this time she meant several things at once. The Millhaven Summer Social was held in the field behind the livery stable, which was the only space in town large enough to accommodate the county's population in one place. By the time Everett pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the field, the afternoon was in full heat, and the crowd was already substantial. Clara sat beside him on the wagon board and did not allow herself to show what she was feeling, which was something close to the sensation she'd had the morning of her wedding. The awareness of walking into a room where people had already been told who she was before she arrived. "Ready," Everett said. "No," she said. "Let's go." He almost smiled. He stepped down and offered his hand, which she accepted, and they walked into the social together, and she felt the moment the crowd registered them. Not a wave exactly. Conversations, halting and restarting, heads turning with the calibrated casualness of people trying to look as though they weren't looking. Everett moved through it with the ease of a man who had been known in this town all his life and had never found other people's opinions particularly interesting. He nodded to people he knew, stopped to shake a hand. Here and there introduced Clara. "Clara Whitmore, my cook and housekeeper. She's been with us a month now." With the simple, unremarkable steadiness of a man presenting information, not seeking approval. Some people shook her hand. Some didn't. She kept her expression open and her chin level and thought about Mrs. Garland, who had known Everett since he was 9 and had handed her a dress and a piece of information that was more useful than either. She had made it halfway through the social and was standing near the lemonade table, talking with reasonable comfort to a rancher's wife named Helen Marsh, who turned out to have strong opinions about the best way to preserve peaches when she saw him. Victor Langley was standing at the far side of the field. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well, and he was in conversation with two men she didn't recognize, and he hadn't seen her yet. He was smiling at something one of the men had said, and the smile was the one she knew best, polished easy, designed to make people feel comfortable enough to stop paying attention. Her hands went still on the lemonade glass. Helen Marsh was saying something about the superiority of hot water bath canning over cold packing, and Clara heard it distantly, the way you hear sounds when your focus has been entirely redirected. Victor turned. He saw her. The polished smile didn't disappear. It changed, became something underneath itself, something that only she could read, because she was the only one in this field who had sat across from him at a breakfast table and understood what he looked like when he was thinking carefully about how to use a situation. He excused himself from the men he was with and began moving across the field in her direction. "Excuse me," Clara said to Helen Marsh, setting down her glass. She went to find Everett. She found him near the edge of the field, talking with Art Conley from the bank, which was, as it turned out, exactly where she needed him to be. "Langley's here," she said low, and even arriving at Everett's shoulder without breaking stride. "He's seen me. He's coming this way." Everett didn't turn or react visibly. He finished what he'd been saying to Conley, then said, "Art, you might want to stay close. This conversation may become relevant to business." Conley blinked. Then he looked over Everett's shoulder, saw Victor Langley approaching across the field, and his face did something complicated. He stayed. Victor arrived. He was 45 lean with the kind of authority that came not from physical size, but from the absolute certainty that he was the most important person in any room he entered. He looked at Everett first, then at Conley, and then at Clara, with an expression of perfect practiced warmth. "Clara," he said, "I've been worried about you." "That's very kind," she said. "There was no need. Running off the way you did?" His voice carried just enough concern to be audible to anyone nearby without being loud enough to be obvious. "Your father has been beside himself." "My father can write to me if he has concerns," she said. "He knows how." Victor's expression shifted toward gentle reproach. "You left before we had a chance to talk properly. There are things about the arrangement that I think you misunderstood." "I understood the arrangement entirely," she said, "including the property transfer clause in Section 4, which is why I have a copy of the contract in the possession of Jim Hart's office." The warmth in Victor's face didn't disappear, but something underneath it recalibrated. "I don't think this is the place," he began. "I agree," Clara said. "If you have legal concerns about the contract documents, Mr. Hart can address them. His office is on 3rd Street. Victor looked at her for a moment. Then he shifted his attention to Everett, and the warmth became something more peer-to-peer, man-to-man, the particular tone of someone looking for a foothold. "Dawson," he said, "I hope you understand the position you've put yourself in harboring someone in a civil matter." "I'm not aware of any civil matter," Everett said. "I hired a cook. She's done the job. That's the sum total of my involvement." He held Victor's gaze. "If you're referring to the land inquiry, my attorney is handling that through the appropriate federal channels. You're welcome to respond in kind." Something moved in Victor's jaw. "The federal inquiry is a misrepresentation of—" "Then represent it correctly," Everett said. "To the land commissioner." Victor was quiet for a moment. He looked at Art Conley, who was standing slightly behind Everett with the expression of a man who had just realized which side of this fence he needed to be on. "Art," Victor said, "the banknote deadline is a matter between me and Mr. Dawson," Conley said with the careful firmness of someone who had just made a decision. "And given the active federal inquiry, I've been advised by our regional counsel that it would be inappropriate to take action on that note while the land dispute is unresolved." A pause. "I meant to tell you this week, Everett. Apologies for the timing." The silence that followed was the kind that lands in a crowd and ripples outward. Victor's expression remained composed. It was, Clara thought, the most frightening thing about him, not his anger, which she had seen and survived, but his composure, which never fully broke, only rerouted itself. "This isn't over," he said. To Everett, to Clara, to the general air between them. I know, Everett said. But it's done for today. Enjoy the social Langley. Victor looked at Clara one last time. You've made a choice, he said quietly. I hope it serves you. It already has, she said. He left. The field noise came back in around them like water filling a space, and Clara became aware that she had been holding every muscle in her body at attention for the last 4 minutes, and her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her. Art Conley exhaled slowly. Well, he said. Thank you, Art, Everett said, for the news about the note. I mean technically that's accurate, what I said. I did receive advice from regional council. It just... Conley looked at Clara. You've got good people around you, Miss Whitmore. That's my assessment. Thank you, Mr. Conley, she said. They didn't stay at the social much longer. The energy had shifted not badly. Clara thought. Not... Victor had intended it to shift, but shifted nonetheless, and Everett read that and made his goodbyes with unhurried efficiency and got them back to the wagon. They rode back up the mountain in the early evening when the sky was going pink at the edges and the pines were casting long shadows across the road, and neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was different from the one on the way down. You were ready for him, Everett said eventually. I've been ready for him for 6 weeks, she said. I just didn't know where he'd appear. The contract clause, Section 4. He glanced at her. You memorized it. I read it 11 times the night before the wedding. You tend to remember things you read 11 times under those circumstances. He was quiet. You were planning your escape from the night before. I was planning my defense, she said. Escape came in the morning when I realized defense wasn't going to be enough. He nodded, slowly absorbing that distinction. Langley's going to come back harder, she said. You know that. What he said, this isn't over, that's not a threat, that's a statement of fact. He means it. I know he means it. He'll look for something we haven't thought of. Clara. His voice was patient. I know. I've been ranching on this mountain for 15 years, and I've dealt with harder men than Victor Langley. She looked at him. Have you? Not smarter, he said, but harder. Men who came at this land with guns instead of lawyers. He kept his eyes on the road. My father built this property before there was a territorial government, before there were courts or banknotes or social obligations. He built it with a rifle and a hammer and the willingness to hold his ground. He paused. I'm his son. I learned from watching him. She was quiet for a moment. What happened to your wife? She said. It came out before she entirely decided to ask it. He didn't stiffen. He went still, which was different. The stillness of someone stopping to pick something up that was too heavy to carry casually. Her name was Ruth, he said. She died in the winter of 1873. A fever. We'd been married 4 years. He paused. We'd been planning to expand the ranch. She had ideas about it. He paused again. She was full of ideas. Clara looked at the road ahead of them. I'm sorry, she said. 10 years ago, he said. You'd think it'd be a smaller thing by now. Does it work that way? He considered. No, he said. It gets different, quieter, but not smaller. He glanced at her. She would have liked you. Clara looked at him. She was practical, he said. Like you. She didn't have patience for people who couldn't handle the honest version of things. Clara looked back at the road. Something moved through her chest. Not discomfort, but the particular tenderness of receiving something fragile. He had offered her a piece of Ruth, and she understood what that cost him, and she held it carefully. Tell me more about her, she said. If you want to. I did. Quietly in fragments, the way people talk about the dead when they've spent years learning how to do it without coming apart a detail about Ruth's laugh, the way she'd argued with Walt about the best way to break a horse, the garden she'd started in the south corner of the yard that still came up wild every spring without anyone tending it. Clara listened. She didn't offer comparisons or comfort. She just listened, which was what the moment required. By the time they reached the ranch yard, the sky was dark and the stars were out, and Caleb's younger sister was watching over the main house and had left a lamp burning in the kitchen window. Everett helped her down from the wagon. She let him this time, without the instinct to demonstrate she didn't need it, and she stood in the yard for a moment while he took the horse to the barn. She looked at the kitchen window, the lamp inside it small and steady. She thought about Victor's face when he'd said, "You've made a choice." She had. She had made it the morning she walked out of that breakfast room, and she had been making it every day since, and standing here on this mountain with this lamp in this window. She thought that maybe the choice was accumulating into something that felt less like running and more like arriving. She went inside and built the fire back up and put the kettle on because Everett would be cold when he came in from the barn, and she had learned without acknowledging that she'd learned it exactly how he took his coffee at night. He came in 20 minutes later. She handed him the cup. He accepted it with a nod, and they sat at the kitchen table across from each other. And it wasn't the silence of strangers anymore, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so. The letter arrived on Tuesday. Not from Hearth's office. Not from Denver. It came directly to the ranch by private writer, sealed with wax, and addressed to Clara Whitmore, in a handwriting she recognized before she even turned it over. The writer handed it to Walt, who handed it to Clara, who looked at it for a moment and then took it inside without opening it. She put it on the kitchen table and stood in front of it, with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she stayed like that until Everett came in from the east pasture. He read her face. Then he read the letter on the table. "Victor," he said. "His handwriting," she said. "Do you want me to open it?" "No," she said. "I'll open it." She picked it up, broke the seal, read it. She read it twice. Then she set it flat on the table, smoothed it once with her palm and said, "He's found my father." Everett waited. "My father has signed the new document," she said. "A statement saying that I left the arranged marriage without cause, that the contract was fair, and I was not coerced, and that he requests in his own handwriting that I return to honor the agreement." Her voice was level in the terrible way voices get when the only alternative is breaking. "Victor is presenting this to the territorial court as a family reconciliation matter. A daughter who has abandoned her contractual and filial obligations." Everett was very still. "He got to my father," she said. "I don't know what he offered him. Money, land, the debt again, something." She pressed her hand flat on the letter. "My father signed it, Everett. He knows what that document is. He knows what it means for me." She stopped, swallowed. "And he signed it." The kitchen was quiet. "Clara," Everett said. "I'm all right," she said. Automatic, reflexive. "You don't have to be all right." She looked at him. Her eyes were dry, and her voice was steady, and everything about her external surface was composed. But he had learned to read her stillness, the variations in it. And this one was the stillness of someone standing at the edge of something they might not be able to come back from. He didn't move toward her. He understood with the instinct of a man who had learned from watching her for 5 weeks that physical comfort offered too early was just another thing she'd have to manage. So he stayed where he was and held her gaze. "He's your father," he said, "and he failed you. Those two things are both true." She looked at him. Something cracked very slightly in her composure, not a collapse, just a fracture hairline, the kind that lets light through. "He always did," she said quietly. "I just kept hoping he'd stop." Everett let that sit. "The document doesn't change the legal position," he said after a moment. "Hart needs to see it immediately. But a statement from your father about a private contract doesn't override a federal land inquiry. Those are separate tracks. It changes the public position," she said. "A father asking for his daughter back. Victor knows exactly what that sounds like in a county full of people who believe family is family. You have Jim Hart's copies of the original contract, including Section 4. I know. And you have Conley's statement from Saturday. I know." She pulled in a breath, straightened. The fracture closed or appeared to close with the precision of someone who had been sealing themselves back together for a very long time. "I'm not going back. Whatever my father signed, whatever Victor tells the court, I'm not going back. That's decided." "I know it is," Everett said. "I'm telling you so you understand what this costs," she said. "What staying here costs. That if I stay, if I fight this, It's going to get louder and more public and more difficult before it gets better. And that is going to land on your ranch and your reputation and everyone here. You need to know that with your whole chest before you decide whether you want to keep standing with me." She held his gaze when she said it direct and unflinching, giving him the honest version without softening it, because she had never been able to stand it when people softened things to spare her, and she would not do it to him. Everett Dawson looked at her across his kitchen table. He picked up the letter. He read it once. He folded it exactly in half and put it in the front of the ranch ledger next to the federal filing and the banknote, and then he looked at her. "I've made my decision," he said. "Same as I made it when I told Langley's man the ranch wasn't for sale. Same as I made it when I didn't let you leave." He held her eyes. "You want to help me fight this, Clara, then stay and help me. You want to walk away and fight it alone, I'll respect that too. But I'm not changing my position because it got harder." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. And it wasn't the question of a woman looking for flattery. It was the honest, baffled question of a person who had been handed kindness so rarely that they had stopped being able to locate the reason for it. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you walked onto this ranch in a torn dress and asked for work, not charity," he said. "And you've done the work every day since. And you're the first person in 3 years who's made this house sound like something other than a place where I'm waiting to die." He paused. "That's worth something. I reckon it's worth a fight." The kitchen was completely quiet. Clara pressed her lips together, looked at the table, looked back up. "All right," she said. Her voice was a little rough at the edges. "Then we fight." He nodded once. "Hart's office first thing tomorrow." "Yes," she said. "And Clara." He stood, picked up his coffee cup, paused at the doorway. "That garden in the south corner, the wild one that comes up every spring." She looked at him, confused by the turn. "Ruth planted it," he said. "I've been meaning to tend it for 10 years and never have." He looked at his window for a moment. "Maybe next spring we do something with it." She stared at him. He went down the hall. She sat at the table for a long time after, with Victor's letter in the ledger, and the lamp burning in the window, and the mountain dark and enormous outside. And she understood in the careful, reluctant way of a person who has been wrong about safety before that something had shifted between them that couldn't be unshifted. She wasn't sure whether to be terrified or grateful. She thought in the end it might be both. Jim Hart read Victor's letter 3 times without speaking. That was not, Clara had come to understand, a good sign. Hart was a man who spoke while he thought, who processed aloud, who narrated his own reasoning as it developed. When he went quiet, it meant the situation had moved into territory that required more care than usual. He set the letter on his desk and looked at it. "The father's statement," he said finally. "That's the problem." "I know," Clara said. "Not because it's legally binding. It isn't, not in the way Langley's presenting it. A father's statement about a private contract doesn't constitute a court order. You're an adult woman of legal age, and no court in this territory is going to compel you to return to an arrangement you've rejected." He paused. "But Langley knows that. He's not filing this with the court because he thinks it'll win there. He's filing it because of what it looks like," Everett said. He was standing near the window, hat in his hands, the way he stood when he was paying careful attention. "Exactly." Hart looked at Clara. "A concerned father, a daughter who ran, a man who claims he was wronged by a breach of contract. In a territorial court, that's a nuisance filing, it goes nowhere. But in a county courthouse on a public docket where anyone can read it." He stopped. "It's a headline, Miss Whitmore. That's what he's buying." Clara had known this. She had known it since she read the letter at the kitchen table 2 nights ago. Knowing it and hearing it stated plainly by a careful man were 2 different things, and the second one had a weight the first didn't. "What can we do?" she said. "2 things." Hart picked up a pen. "First, your copies of the original contract, the Section 4 property transfer clause. I need those filed with my office as a counter exhibit before Langley's document hits the public docket. If the original contract is already on record showing coercive terms, his father's statement is contextualized before anyone reads it. I have them here," she said, and produced the folded papers from her coat pocket, the ones she'd kept behind the loose board under the window. the ones she'd grabbed in the dark the night before her wedding, while her hands were shaking. Hart took them, looked at them. His expression shifted. Section 4, he said. Property transfer contingent on marriage. Automatic. No separate consent required. He looked up. This would have made everything you earned or inherited the legal property of Victor Langley from the moment the ceremony concluded. Yes, she said. And you understood that when you left. I understood it when I read it the night before. I left the morning after. Hart set the papers down with the careful deliberateness of a man setting down something that required handling. Miss Whitmore, he said, this contract is unconscionable. Any territorial judge worth his salary is going to see that. Victor knows that too, she said. That's why he's not fighting the contract in court. He's fighting it in the street. Hart nodded. Which brings me to the second thing. He looked at Everett. I need character witnesses. People in this county who know Miss Whitmore, or who can speak to her conduct and her situation from direct observation. Not hearsay, not sympathy. Actual witnesses. Everett looked at Clara. Clara looked at her hands. Walt Greer, Everett said. He's been at the ranch the whole time. He'll speak plainly. Good. Who else? Helen Marsh, Clara said quietly. From the social. She spent 20 minutes talking with me about peach preserving, and she didn't flinch when Victor arrived. She paused. And Mrs. Garland, the seamstress. Hart wrote the names down. I'll speak with them this week. He looked at both of them. There's one more thing, and I want to say it clearly, so there's no misunderstanding. He set down his pen. The federal inquiry on the water diversion and the unauthorized grazing that is moving forward. The Land Commissioner's office has sent a preliminary investigator. He'll be in Millhaven by Friday. He paused. When he arrives, Langley will know. And when Langley knows, the timeline on everything else accelerates. Clara felt Everett go still beside her, the particular stillness of a man recalculating. How much time? Everett said. Days, Hart said. Not weeks. Once the investigator arrives and starts asking questions publicly, Langley loses the ability to operate quietly. He'll have to commit to a position or withdraw. In my experience, men like Langley don't withdraw. Everett looked at Clara. Then we make sure we're ready before Friday, he said. They were not entirely ready by Friday. They were close. Hart had filed the original contract with the territorial office by Wednesday. Walt had given his statement blunt, factual, and devastating in its plainness on Thursday morning. Helen Marsh had done the same Thursday afternoon with the additional detail that she had personally witnessed Victor Langley approach Clara at the social and observed what she described as the manner of a man attempting to intimidate a woman who declined to be intimidated. Mrs. Garland had not been available for a formal statement. She had, however, sent Hart a written note that said in 4 sentences exactly what she thought of Victor Langley's character and exactly what she had observed of Clara Whitmore's, and Hart had read it and said it was possibly the most efficient legal document he had received in 20 years of practice. The federal investigator arrived on Friday as promised. His name was Thomas Reed, and he was a methodical, unimpressive-looking man from Denver who wore a brown suit and carried a leather satchel and asked questions in a flat, unhurried voice that gave nothing away. He came to the ranch on Friday afternoon, looked at the water diversion with the expression of a man confirming what he'd already been told. Asked Everett 7 specific questions, wrote down the answers in a small notebook and left. I didn't tell them what he'd concluded. He didn't tell them the timeline. He thanked Everett for his time and rode back down the mountain, and that was the whole of it, and the uncertainty that followed was in some ways harder than the conflict itself. Clara made supper that night, and they ate all of them. Everett, Walt, Pete, Hank, Caleb, and the 2 other hands at the long bunkhouse table, and the conversation was quieter than usual. Not tense exactly. Just careful the way people are when they know something is building toward a point, and they don't yet know what the point will be. After supper, Hank Pruitt appeared in the kitchen doorway. Clara was washing up. She looked at him when he came in and waited. He stood there for a moment, with the particular discomfort of a young man who has decided to do something that requires more courage than he typically exercises. I gave a statement, he said, to Hart. She turned to face him. When, this afternoon, went into town on my own. He looked at the floor, then back up. I told him what I said to you that first week, the things I said in the kitchen. His jaw moved. And I told him that you gave me the information about the burn poultice anyway. That you helped me even after I... He stopped. I thought it was relevant, to your character. He looked like the word character was slightly larger than he was comfortable with, but he'd gotten it out anyway. Ma'am. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, Hank, she said. He nodded, turned to leave. Hank. He stopped. The burn healed clean, she said. I noticed. His ears went red. Yes, ma'am, he said and left. She turned back to the washing up, and she was very careful not to let the feeling that moved through her chest show on her face, because it was the kind of feeling that if you let it out, was difficult to put back. The twist came on Saturday morning, and it came from a direction none of them had anticipated. Clara was in the kitchen at first light when she heard the horse, not from the south road, not from the mountain trail, but from the east, the direction nobody came from, because there was no road there, only the federal grazing land and the Dawson property line. She went to find Walt. He was already at the barn door, looking toward the east pasture. Pete was beside him. The rider was a woman. She was riding hard, which was the first unusual thing. The second was the horse, not a ranch horse, not a trail horse, but a quality animal, the kind of horse a person rode when they had means and were in a hurry. She came across the east pasture fence at a gate Clara hadn't known existed and pulled up in the yard with the horse blowing and her own breath short, and she was maybe 55 years old and sat a saddle like someone who had done it all her life, and she looked around the yard until she found Clara. You're Clara Whitmore, she said. I am, Clara said. My name is Margaret Voss. She dismounted with the efficiency of a woman who didn't need help and didn't want it. I own the property east of the federal land, 3,000 acres. She handed her reins to Pete without looking at him. I need to speak with you and Everett Dawson, right now, before Langley's man gets here. Clara went for Everett. Margaret Voss sat at the kitchen table and talked for 20 minutes without stopping, and what she said rearranged everything. She had been watching Victor Langley's northward expansion for 3 years. She had watched him acquire properties through debt, manipulation, through social pressure, through legal maneuvering that was always technically legitimate and always morally something else. She had watched him because he'd done it to her neighbor in Colorado, and she'd seen how it ended, and she'd made it her particular business to understand his methods before he turned them on her. I wants a corridor, she said. A contiguous block of land from his Colorado holdings north through Wyoming to the territorial rail line. The Dawson Ranch is the keystone. Without it, the corridor has a gap that makes the whole thing less valuable. She looked at Everett. That's why he's willing to go to federal court over a water diversion. The land is worth 10 times the legal trouble. We know about the corridor, Everett said. Langley's been buying north all spring. What you don't know, Margaret said, is that he's not buying with his own money. The kitchen went quiet. He has investors, she said. Chicago money mostly, a land development syndicate. They've been putting capital into the corridor acquisition for 18 months. She opened the leather satchel she'd brought in and laid a document on the table. I have a copy of the syndicate agreement. My lawyer obtained it through a contact in Chicago who had reason to want the arrangement disrupted. She looked at them both. The syndicate agreement includes a performance clause. Langley must complete the full corridor acquisition by the end of this calendar year, or the investors have the right to withdraw their capital and pursue their own claims against properties he's already acquired using syndicate funds. Everett picked up this document. Read the first page. If the federal inquiry delays his acquisition of this land, Clara began. He misses the performance deadline, Margaret confirmed. The syndicate pulls out, and when the syndicate pulls out, at least 4 of the properties he's already bought in this corridor become financially unstable because he leveraged them against the syndicate's continued investment. Clara stared at her. He doesn't just lose the corridor, she said slowly. He loses what he's already built. The whole thing collapses, Margaret said. Which is why he's been moving so fast. And why the personal pressure. She looked at Clara. The father's letter, the reputation campaign, the social maneuvering, it's not just vindictiveness. He's trying to get you off this property and get Everett compliant before the federal investigator's report freezes him out. Everett set down the document. He looked at Clara. Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, but the particular look of a man seeing the full shape of a thing he'd only been seeing in pieces. How fast does this help us? He said to Margaret. Your lawyer needs this document before Monday morning, she said. The syndicate information changes the federal inquiry from a property dispute to a potential securities matter. That triggers a different level of federal involvement, one that moves faster and hits harder. She paused. I have more. 3 affidavits from property owners in Colorado who went through the same acquisition process. They were willing to be quiet before. They're less willing now that there's a federal inquiry to attach to. Why? Clara said. Why bring this to us? Margaret looked at her directly. Because I'm next, she said simply. My property is east of the federal land. If Langley completes the corridor through Dawson's ranch, he has 3 sides of me, and I have no interest in being on those 3 sides. She paused. And because I've been watching what he did to you, Miss Whitmore, since before you left Colorado. I knew your father, not well, but I knew what happened to him. Her voice didn't soften, but something in it acknowledged the weight. You deserved better than what you got. So did he before Langley found his weakness. Clara was very still. My father's weakness, she said quietly, was that he loved me and didn't know how to protect me. No, Margaret said not unkindly. His weakness was that he believed a dishonest man's promise more than he believed his own daughter's judgment. She held Clara's gaze. That's a different thing, and it's his to carry, not yours. The kitchen was completely silent. Everett reached across the table and picked up the syndicate document and Margaret's 3 affidavits and stacked them with the care of a man handling something load-bearing. I'll ride to Hearth this morning, he said. I'll go with you, Margaret said. My lawyer in Denver has already been briefed. He can be on a train by Monday. And Langley, Clara said. When he finds out we have this, he'll come, Margaret said flatly. In person. He won't send a rider for this. When a man's whole structure is at risk, he comes himself. She paused. That's when it gets dangerous. Langley came on Sunday. He didn't come with riders. He came with 3 men, not ranch hands, not lawyers, but the particular kind of men who stood slightly too close and didn't remove their hats when they came into a yard, and who looked at a person the way people look at furniture. They're assessing for removal. He came to the ranch in the late afternoon, and he came to the front of the main house, and he did not knock. He called out, Dawson, I think it's time we talked like men. Everett was at the barn when the call came. He heard it and didn't hurry. He finished what he was doing, set down his tools, and came out of the barn and crossed the yard at his own pace with Walt at his left shoulder and Pete at his right, and he stopped 10 feet from Langley and his 3 men and stood there with his thumbs in his belt and his hat on his head. Langley, he said. I'm going to make this simple, Victor said. He was very composed, but there was something underneath the composure that hadn't been there at the social. Something tighter, less patient. The quality of a man who has run out of the particular luxury of time. You release the federal hold on your property claim. You sign over the water rights to the creek easement, and you let Miss Whitmore go. He paused. In exchange, your banknote disappears, paid in full, today. The yard was quiet. Caleb had appeared in the bunkhouse doorway. Hank was at the water trough very still. The 2 other hands were at various points around the yard, having found reasons to be there without being called. Everett looked at Victor Langley for a long moment. No, he said. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm offering you your ranch, Dawson. I already have my ranch. For now. The bank deadline has been suspended pending the federal inquiry, Everett said, which I expect your lawyers told you, which is why you're standing in my yard instead of sitting in an office. Victor looked at him. The federal inquiry is a nuisance, he said. I've dealt with federal inquiries before. They take years and go nowhere. This one has a syndicate agreement attached to it, Everett said, and 3 Colorado affidavits, and a Denver attorney who will be in Millhaven by Tuesday. The composure broke. Not completely. Victor Langley was too controlled for that, but it fractured, and the fracture was visible for exactly 3 seconds before he repaired it. And in those 3 seconds, Clara, who had come out of the main house and was standing on the porch, understood that he had not known about Margaret Voss. He had not known they had the syndicate document. He looked at Clara, and his expression, stripped of its usual performance, was for a moment simply the face of a man who had played a long game carefully and had just discovered someone had been playing a longer one. "You," he said. "Me," she agreed. "Where did you get it?" "That's not something I'm required to tell you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at Everett, and the calculation in his face shifted, and Clara felt something change in the air of the yard, a change in temperature, in intent, and she said loudly and clearly, "Don't." Everyone looked at her. She came down off the porch and walked across the yard and stopped beside Everett, not behind him, not at a safe distance, but beside him, shoulder to shoulder with the man she had arrived next to in a torn dress 6 weeks ago. And she looked at Victor Langley with every year of knowing him, and every morning she'd spent planning, and every night she'd spent being afraid, and she said what she had been carrying for 3 years. "You took my father's farm, and you tried to take me with it," she said. "You made my father believe he owed you something he could only pay with his daughter. And when I said no, you used your fist." Her voice was even, not loud, perfectly clear. "In front of witnesses at a public social, I offered you the legal path. In front of witnesses right now, I'm telling you there is no other path. The syndicate document is already in Jim Hart's office. The affidavits are already in Denver. The federal investigator already has his report." She held his gaze. "It's over, Victor. Not because I ran, because I stopped running." The yard was very still. Victor looked at her, at Everett, at Walt and Pete and Hank and Caleb and every man on the ranch who had found his way to a position within range of this conversation. He looked at his own 3 men who were looking at the Dawson hands with the particular reassessment of men who have counted a room and found the count unfavorable. "This isn't finished," Victor said. But his voice had changed, still controlled, but changed the way a fire changes when you've taken its fuel away. "Yes, it is," Everett said. "Get off my property." Victor Langley looked at the land around him, the ranch, the mountain, the summer sky for one long moment. Then he put on his hat, which he had been holding, and he turned and walked to his horse, and his 3 men followed, and they rode down the mountain road and didn't look back. The yard held its silence until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then Walt said with magnificent understatement, "Well, that went all right." Caleb made a sound that was definitely not a cheer on account of being too old for cheering, but bore a strong resemblance to one. Hank looked at Clara with an expression that was equal parts admiration and relief. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "That was, I mean. Yes, ma'am." She looked at him. "Go finish the water trough, Hank." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went. The hands dispersed slowly with the particular reluctance of people who have witnessed something and are not quite ready to stop thinking about it. Pete followed Walt to the barn. Caleb went back to the bunkhouse with an expression of deep personal satisfaction that he would probably be describing for the rest of the summer to anyone who would listen. Everett and Clara stood in the yard alone. She became aware slowly that she was shaking. Not visibly, she had too much practice holding herself still for it to show. But inside, in the place where she'd been keeping herself composed for 4 minutes, while she said the truest thing she'd ever said to the person it needed to be said to, there was a trembling that had no place to go. Everett turned and looked at her. He saw it the way he saw things, not intrusively, but accurately. "Clara," he said. "I'm all right," she said. "You said that last time, and you weren't." She looked at him. Something shifted in her, the composure not breaking, but becoming something more honest than composure. Something more tired and more real. She started. Stopped. "No," she said. "Actually, I'm not entirely all right. She pressed her lips together. "I've been afraid of that man for 3 years," she said. "Every decision I made, every step I took, every morning I woke up and figured out where to go next. I've been making those decisions in relationship to him, running from him, or planning around him, or bracing for him." She looked at her own hands. "And he just left." Her voice was low and slightly bewildered. "He just rode away." "He rode away," Everett said, "because you took everything he had to work with." "We took it," she said. "Yes," he said. "We did." She looked up at him, at the steadiness of him which she had come to understand was not indifference, but its opposite. The steadiness of a man who felt things deeply enough to have learned not to be moved by them carelessly. "What happens now?" she said. "Hearth files the syndicate document. Denver processes the report. The banknote gets cleared once the federal inquiry resolves." He paused. "It'll take months, but the direction is set." "And Langley? He has bigger problems than us now. When the syndicate pulls their capital." He left it unfinished because they both knew what the end of that sentence was. She nodded slowly. She was still shaking very slightly in the place only she could feel. "Everett," she said. "Yeah, I need to write to my father." She said it steadily, looking at the middle distance. "Not to forgive him. I'm not there yet. Maybe I won't get there. But he should know that I'm all right. And he should know what Victor Langley's syndicate was and what he was actually a piece of, because my father doesn't know that. He thinks he was making a business deal with a businessman." She paused. "He wasn't. He was a piece in a very large scheme that was never about me or about him at all." Everett was quiet for a moment. "That might help him," he said, "understanding it that way." "It might not change anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you'll know you did it. And knowing you did the right thing, even the hard right thing, even the one that doesn't get thanked, that's not nothing." She looked at him. "You sound like someone who's done a few hard right things themselves." "Once or twice," he said. She almost smiled. The shaking somewhere inside her was beginning to still. "I should start supper," she said. "Clara." His voice stopped her. She turned. Howe was looking at her with the direct, unguarded expression. He rarely used, the one she had seen 3 times in 6 weeks. Always at the moments when the situation had stripped away everything that wasn't essential and left just the two of them in a kitchen or on a mountainside, honest with each other in the particular way that only comes from having been through something together. "What you said to him," Everett said, "in the yard. You didn't do that for the land deal. You didn't do that for the federal case." She held his gaze. "You did that because it was true," he said, "and because you'd been carrying it long enough." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I had." He nodded. He looked at the yard, then back at her. "I've been carrying something too," he said. "For 10 years. The kind of carrying where you think the weight is just who you are now, and you forget it's something you picked up." She waited. "This ranch," he said. "I've been managing it, running it, keeping it alive the way you keep a grave tended. Not because I didn't love it, because I did, and loving things that are half gone is its own kind of weight." He paused. "These past 6 weeks. The east pasture, the water problem, the legal fight." He stopped. "Waking up and hearing someone in the kitchen." She looked at him. "I stopped managing," he said. "Somewhere in the middle of all of it. It started mattering in a different way." He held her eyes. "You did that." The yard was quiet. Somewhere in the barn, a horse moved. The mountain held them both in the particular enormous calm of late afternoon. "Everett," she said carefully. "I don't know what I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You've got a life to figure out, a father to write to, a future that belongs to you and nobody else. I know that." He paused. "I just wanted you to know what these 6 weeks have been, from my side." She looked at him for a long time. "The garden," she said finally. "In the south corner. Ruth's garden." "Yes. You said maybe next spring we do something with it." "I did." She was quiet for another moment, and then she said something that she had not entirely planned to say, but that came out of the same place where all her truest things came from, the place that had been surviving, rather than speaking, for 3 years, and had over the course of 6 weeks on a mountain in Wyoming learned something different. "I'd like that," she said. "Next spring." Everett looked at her. The expression on his face was not dramatic. He was not a dramatic man. But it was completely real, and she had learned in 6 weeks of watching him that completely real was the rarest and most valuable thing he had to offer. "All right," he said. He put his hat on and went back to the barn, and she went inside and started supper, and the house sounded the way it had been sounding for weeks, like a place where someone was at home, and neither of them said anything more about it, because they didn't need to. Some things didn't need to be said more than once. The lamp was already lit in the kitchen window before the sun was fully down. The letter to her father took Clara 4 days to write, not because she didn't know what to say. She knew exactly what to say. She had been composing it in her head since the night Victor rode off the mountain, since she'd sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and understood that the running was finished, and what came next was something else entirely. The problem was not the words. The problem was the order of them. The problem was that she kept starting with anger, and arriving at something softer, or starting with softness, and arriving somewhere she hadn't intended to go. And she had torn up 3 versions before she understood that the letter she needed to write was the one that held both things at once, without resolving either. She wrote it on a Thursday morning before anyone else was up at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, and when she finished, she read it once and folded it without reading it again, because reading it again would mean changing it. And what she had written was true, and true things didn't benefit from revision. She wrote that she was alive and well, and employed on a ranch in Wyoming territory. She wrote that she understood now the full scope of what Victor Langley had been doing, not just to her, not just to their family, but across 3 states and 18 months. A scheme large enough that her father had been, as much as anything else, a victim of it himself. She wrote that this did not excuse what he had signed. She wrote it plainly, without cruelty, in the same tone she used when she told Hank Pruitt about the burn poultice, factual, clear, not unkind, but not softened. She wrote that she did not know when she would be ready to forgive him, and that she was not going to pretend a timeline she didn't have. She wrote that she hoped he was eating properly, and that the East Field had recovered from the dry spell. She wrote at the very end that she had found somewhere she intended to stay. She sealed it and gave it to Caleb to post, and she went back to the kitchen and built the fire up and started breakfast. And she did not cry, which she considered a reasonable achievement given the circumstances. Everett found her at the stove when he came in, and read the particular set of her shoulders, and said nothing, which was exactly right, and poured his own coffee, and stood at the window and looked at the mountain while she cooked, and the silence between them was the kind that had weight and warmth in equal measure. After a while he said, "Did you send it?" "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Good." That was all. It was enough. Thomas Reed, the federal investigator, returned to the ranch on a Friday, 2 weeks after his first visit, and this time he came with a colleague and a formal document case, and the expression of a man who had finished his calculations and was prepared to present the results. He sat at the kitchen table. Clara's kitchen table, which had become over the course of the summer. The table where all the important things happened. And he opened his document case and laid out 3 pages in a precise row and looked at Everett. "The water diversion," he said, "was deliberate and recent, as your attorney documented. The timber used matches a supplier operating out of Cheyenne who has existing contracts with Langley Land Holdings in Colorado." He paused. "That establishes intent. The unauthorized grazing on federal land has been confirmed by survey. Over 400 head of Langley cattle moved through the federal corridor between May and August." He paused again. "And the syndicate document your attorney submitted to Denver last week." He looked at his colleague, who gave a slight nod. "The U.S. Land Commissioner's Office has forwarded the matter to the federal attorney in Denver. There are concerns about securities misrepresentation in the syndicate agreement that go beyond a simple land dispute." Everett looked at Reed steadily. "What does that mean for the ranch?" "It means the banknote cannot be actioned while the federal matter is active," Reed said. "Your attorney will receive formal notification this week. The note is effectively suspended." He paused. It also means that Victor Langley's ability to acquire land in this territory is complicated to say the least for the foreseeable future. Clara set down the coffee pot she'd been holding and looked at Reed. His investors, she said, have been informed of the federal inquiry, Reed said. I can't speak to their internal decisions, but the performance clause in the syndicate agreement, as I understand it, makes their position straightforward once a federal investigation is active. Clara looked at Everett. Everett looked at the 3 pages on the table. It's over, he said. Not a question. Not relief exactly, more like a man setting down a weight and taking stock of his own hands. The land dispute is resolved in your favor, Reed said. The broader federal matter will take time, but your position is secure. He gathered his pages. Congratulations, Mr. Dawson. You held your ground. He looked at Clara when he said it. Not pointedly. Just looked in the way of a man acknowledging what he'd actually observed versus what the official record would reflect. We held it, Everett said. Reed closed his document case. Yes, he said. You did. The news moved through Millhaven with the particular velocity of things people had been waiting to hear. By Saturday, the general understanding in the county was that Victor Langley's land scheme had collapsed under federal scrutiny, that the Dawson Ranch was clear, and that the woman who had been the subject of considerable gossip for 6 weeks had been, as Walt Greer had said in his statement to Hearth, with characteristic plainness, a capable and honest worker who had done nothing worth gossiping about. Mrs. Pruitt at the general store apparently spent a full afternoon reconsidering her earlier opinions. Helen Marsh was reported to have said, "I told you so," to her husband 3 times in one morning. Mrs. Garland said nothing, but was observed to be looking satisfied in a very particular way. Hank Pruitt, who had started the summer as the person on the ranch least likely to be improved by the experience, appeared to have been quietly and thoroughly improved by it. He had stopped making comments designed to make himself feel larger at others' expense. He had started tentatively helping Caleb with tasks that were slightly beyond Caleb's reach without being asked. Clara noticed this and didn't comment on it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Walt told Everett in the barn, away from anyone else, that he thought things had worked out reasonably well, considering. Everett said they had. Walt said he was glad Clara had stayed. Everett looked at the horse he was brushing and said he was too. Walt said nothing further because nothing further was required and went back to work. The twist that came in the 3rd week of August arrived not from Denver or Millhaven or Victor Langley's collapsing empire, but from Clara's father. He wrote back. She had not expected him to write back, or not so quickly. It had been 10 days, barely enough time for her letter to reach Colorado, and a reply to return, and she had prepared herself for silence, which was the answer she had most anticipated. The envelope appeared in the ranch's weekly post delivery on a Tuesday, and Caleb brought it to her in the kitchen, with the careful expression of a boy who had learned to read rooms. She looked at the handwriting on the front. Her father's hand cramped, slightly trembling at the edges the way it had been since her mother died, and he'd taken on more worry than his body knew what to do with. She put it in her apron pocket and finished what she was doing and waited until after supper, when the kitchen was clean and the house was quiet, before she opened it. She read it at the table by lamplight, and Everett came in for his evening coffee and found her sitting there with the letter in her hands and an expression on her face that he had not seen before. Not the controlled stillness of someone managing themselves, not the working concentration she wore through most of her day, but something younger and less defended, something that looked like it had traveled a long way to get to the surface. He poured his coffee and sat down across from her and waited. She folded the letter. He didn't know, she said, about the syndicate, about what Langley was actually building. She pressed the folded letter flat on the table. He thought it was a debt settlement and a marriage arrangement. He didn't know about the Chicago investors, or the corridor, or the securities matter. He thought he was handing his daughter to a rich man with a cattle operation. She paused. He thought he was solving a problem. Everett was quiet. "I was wrong," she said. He was wrong in the way that people are wrong when they take the easiest answer because they're afraid of the harder ones. He was wrong in the way my mother always said he would be wrong someday, Because he could never face a difficult thing head-on. He always had to find the door in the side. She stopped, breathed. He was wrong, but he didn't know what he was part of. "Does that change things?" Everett asked. Careful, not leading. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "It changes how I understand it. Whether it changes how I feel about it, that takes longer." She looked at the letter. He asked if he could write again. "What did you decide?" "I'm going to say yes," she said. "Not because everything is fixed. It isn't. But because he's my father, and he's 61 years old, and he made a terrible mistake, and he knows it, and I'm not going to be the person who closes that door permanently out of pride." She looked at Everett. "Is that weak?" "No," he said without hesitation. "Some people would say. Some people haven't had to make that choice," he said. "Forgiving someone when they've hurt you isn't weakness. It's just harder than not forgiving them, and people confuse harder with weaker." He paused. "My father and I didn't speak for 2 years when I was young. Over something I was right about. And I was right. And those 2 years were the worst I can account for, not because I was wrong, but because being right and being alone with it doesn't feel the way you think it's going to feel." Clara looked at him. "What changed it?" "He got sick," Everett said. "And I went. And when I was there, I realized that the argument had been real, but the 2 years had been a choice and a bad one." He held his coffee cup. "He died 6 months later. I had 6 months instead of 2 more years of nothing." He paused. That was enough. It was almost not enough, and then it was enough. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "I'll write back." She put the letter in her room, and when she came back to the kitchen, Everett was still at the table, and she sat back down, and they drank their coffee together in the way they had been drinking coffee together for 2 months, with the easiness of two people who have stopped needing to perform anything for each other, and the lamp burned steady in the window, and outside the mountain was doing what it always did. Margaret Voss came back to the ranch on the last Friday of August. She came properly this time by the south road at a reasonable hour, without urgency, and she tied her horse at the rail and knocked on the main house door and waited, which was different from her first appearance in ways that both Clara and Everett noted. Clara let her in, made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, and Margaret laid out what she had come to say. The Denver attorney had been in touch. The federal matter was proceeding, and Langley's investors had, as predicted, triggered the performance clause. 3 of the Colorado properties were already in financial distress. Langley himself had retreated to Cheyenne, where he was, according to Margaret's contacts, engaged in vigorous and probably unsuccessful negotiation with the syndicate's representatives. "He's not coming back here," Margaret said. "Not for the land, not for anything else. He has too many fires in too many places." She paused. "The property to the east, the federal grazing land. The Land Commissioner's Office is considering opening it to legitimate homestead applications once the investigation concludes." "How long?" Everett said. "Spring, probably." She looked at him. "I'd file early if I were you. Not for yourself, your property line is settled, but some of your men might want to know." Everett glanced at Clara, who was already thinking about Walt, who had mentioned once in passing that he'd always thought about having a piece of ground of his own before he got too old to work it. "I'll tell them," Everett said. Margaret finished her coffee and stood. She looked at Clara with the direct, unsentimental expression that Clara had come to understand was simply how Margaret Voss looked when she respected someone. "You held up well," she said. "Better than most would have." "I had help," Clara said. "You did," Margaret agreed. "But help only works when the person receiving it holds their end." She put on her coat. "I expect we'll be neighbors for some time." "I expect so," Clara said. Margaret Voss shook hands with both of them and rode east, and that was that. September came in over the mountain with the particular quality of Wyoming. Late summer, the day still warm, the mornings beginning to carry the first suggestion of what was coming. The light going gold at a lower angle, that meant the season was turning even if the heat hadn't let go yet. The east pasture cattle had recovered fully. Walt reported it without ceremony, 20 head at weight 3 above target, and Everett received it the same way, and neither of them said anything about the fact that it had been Clara's idea, because it didn't need to be said. The results said it. The banknote was formally withdrawn on the 4th of September. Jim Hart delivered the paperwork himself, riding up the mountain in the early afternoon, with the expression of a man who had been looking forward to this particular trip since August. He sat at the kitchen table. He had become comfortable with the kitchen table, and he laid out the document, and Everett signed it, and Hart signed his witness line, and they shook hands. And then Hart accepted a piece of the pie Clara had made that morning, because she had made it partly for this occasion, having known when she put it in the oven that today was likely to be the day. "How did you know?" Everett asked her after Hart had ridden back down. "I didn't know," she said. "I thought it was probable. There's a difference." She cut a second piece. "Also, Walt likes pie and I needed an excuse." He looked at her with the expression that had stopped surprising her sometime in August, the one that lived between humor and something warmer in the small space where Everett Dawson allowed himself to find things genuinely good. "Clara," he said. "Yes, thank you, for the pie." A pause. "For all of it." She met his eyes. "You're welcome," she said. "For all of it." She almost left in the second week of September. This was the part she had not told anyone, not Walt, not Hart, not Margaret Voss, not even the version of herself she presented at the kitchen table every morning. It lived in her privately, the way the most difficult things did. The situation was resolved. The land was safe. Victor Langley was gone. Her father had written twice more, and the correspondence had the careful, tentative quality of two people learning to speak to each other after a long silence, which was painful and necessary in equal measure. She had wages saved enough finally for the first time in 3 years to constitute an actual start. She had options. Real ones, not the theoretical kind she'd been carrying in her back pocket for survival purposes. She could stay in Millhaven. Hart had mentioned not casually that his office needed someone who could manage documents and correspondence and had the kind of organized mind that Clara demonstrably had. She could go to Denver where Margaret Voss had contacts who valued competent women without requiring them to be wives or daughters. She could, for the first time in her adult life, choose not based on what was available, but based on what she actually wanted. And what she actually wanted had become over the course of one summer on a Wyoming mountain, something she had not anticipated wanting when she stepped off that wagon in a torn dress and asked a stranger for work. She stood in her room on a Tuesday evening with her small bag open on the bed and her folded dresses inside it, and she looked at the bag and at the room, and she thought about the garden in the south corner, and she thought about coffee before dawn with the fire going and the sound of the mountain coming in through the kitchen window. And she thought about Everett's voice, saying some things. Don't get smaller, they get different. And she thought about Ruth's garden coming up wild every spring, without anyone to tend it and waiting. She unpacked the bag. She folded everything back, and put it in the drawer, and closed the drawer, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and said out loud to nobody, "All right then." And that was the decision made in private, the way the real ones always are, without ceremony, and without an audience in a small room, with a lock on the door, that she had chosen herself. She told Everett that evening. Not the part about the bag that was hers, but the part that needed to be told. They were in the kitchen after supper, the usual time, the usual coffee, and she looked at him across the table and said, "I want to talk about staying." He looked at her. "Not as the cook," she said, "or not only as the cook. I want to talk about what it means to stay here, long term." She held his gaze. "I want to know what that looks like to you before I decide anything, because I'm not going to build something on ground I haven't tested." He was quiet for a moment. "What ground do you need to test?" he said. "Whether you're asking me to stay because you need the kitchen managed," she said, "or because you want me here." He looked at her steadily. "Clara," he said, "I've needed a cook for 3 years. I've gotten along without one." He paused. "I don't want to get along without you." She looked at him, at the completely unadorned, plainly delivered truth of it. "That's the difference," she said, "between need and want." "Yes, I want to stay," she said. I want to stay because I choose to not, because I have nowhere else to go, because I do have somewhere else to go now, and I'm choosing this instead." She pressed her hands flat on the table, the gesture she made when she was anchoring herself to something real. "I want to tend the garden in the spring. I want to sit at this table next winter and argue with Walt about the feed schedule. I want—" She stopped. "I want to learn what this mountain looks like in every season, not just summer." Everett looked at her for a long moment. "Then stay," he said. "I'm staying," she said. "But I want to be clear that I'm staying as a person with her own stake in this. Not a hired hand who can be let go. Not a guest who can be asked to leave." She looked at him. "I want to be someone who belongs here." "You already belong here," he said. "You've belonged here since you fixed Walt's wrong-headed feed rotation in week 2 and didn't even tell him you'd done it." Something moved in her face that was too large and too real for her to contain, the way she usually contained things. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up. "Next spring," she said. "The garden." "Next spring," he said. He didn't reach across the table. He wasn't that kind of man, not yet, not without the time and the ground for it. But he looked at her in the way that had become over the course of one summer the most honest thing in her life, direct and unperforming and entirely real. And she looked back, and between them the lamplight held steady, and the mountain was quiet outside, and the decision that had been building since the morning, she stepped off a wagon in a torn dress, reached its full and final shape. Duh! It was Walt who asked her in November whether she and Everett were going to get married. He asked it in the barn, while she was helping him with the winter feed inventory, which she'd taken on because someone needed to do it, and she was better at the numbers than anyone else on the ranch. He asked it with the directness of a man who had run out of patience for things that were obvious not being stated. She didn't look up from the ledger. "That's a very direct question, Walt. I'm a direct man." "Is there a particular reason you're asking?" "Because I've ordered seeds for the south garden for spring," he said. "And I need to know whether I'm ordering for 2 people or 1, because that changes what I get." She looked up. He was looking back at her with the expression of a man who was an inch away from being satisfied and would accept only one answer. 2, she said. Walt nodded. "Good," he said. "I'll get the seed catalog." I went to the tack room and came back with a battered catalog and set it on the hay bale beside her and went back to counting feed sacks. And Clara looked at the catalog and thought about Ruth's garden coming up wild every spring, without anyone tending it, and thought about what it meant to tend something and what it meant to let something grow. Everett asked her in December, when the first snow had come down from the high country and the ranch was in the quiet of early winter, and he asked her the way he did everything that mattered, without ceremony, without performance, without anything between the question and the truth. They were at the kitchen table. Morning, coffee. The lamp still burning because the December mornings came up slow. He said, "I'd like to marry you, if that's something you want." She looked at him across the table. At the man who had hired her when she had nothing, who had stood beside her when she had nowhere left to run, who had offered her Ruth's garden and his father's stubbornness, and the particular steady patience of a man who had learned the hard way that love was a choice you made every morning and not a feeling that arrived once and stayed without tending. "It's something I want," she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. "That's settled then," he said, and it was. They married in June of 1884, on the last warm evening before the mountain summer turned from beautiful to relentless, with Jim Hart as witness, and Walt Greer as the nearest thing to family. Either of them had assembled in Wyoming, and Margaret Voss riding over from the east in her best coat, and Caleb in a shirt that had been ironed for the first time in recent memory, and Hank Pruitt standing in the back with the expression of a young man who had started the year as one kind of person and ended it as another, and was still figuring out what to do with the difference. The garden in the south corner had come up that spring for the first time in 11 years, with someone tending it. Clara had learned what Ruth had planted: lavender and sage, and a climbing rose that had gone woody and wild, but still bloomed stubborn and red when the weather was right. She had cut it back and composted it and added what she wanted beside what Ruth had started, and the result was something that was neither hers alone nor Ruth's alone, but belonged to the place itself, to the ongoing life of the ranch, which was perhaps what a garden was for. Everett stood beside her under the June sky and said the words that meant he was choosing her, and she said the words that meant she was choosing him, and the mountain held them in its enormous, indifferent, entirely beautiful way. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Dawson, now by her own choosing, looked at the ring on her hand and thought about all the mornings she had woken up afraid, and all the decisions she had made in the dark, and all the miles between the breakfast room in Colorado and this exact moment. And she thought that the distance between where she had been and where she was standing could not be measured in miles at all. It could only be measured in choices. In the daily, unspectacular, essential work of choosing the harder right thing over the easier wrong one. In the particular courage of a woman who had been told her whole life that her value was determined by what someone else was willing to pay for her, and who had stood on a mountain in Wyoming in a torn dress and said, "I am asking for work, not charity," and meant it with every cell in her body. She had earned this, not because she'd been good enough or patient enough or brave enough by someone else's measure, because she had decided in the dark of her own private morning that she was worth the fight, and then she had fought it one honest day at a time until the fight was finished, and what remained was this: a man who chose her back, a mountain that held them both, a garden growing between what was and what could be, and a life that was hers, wholly, finally, irrevocably hers, because she had chosen it and she had stayed.